external event. It's actually a research method. So talking about it and having public discussions and bringing in outsiders or people who are marginal to your own individual research, one's own individual research, and then extending it outwards, reaching outwards to find out, well, what is the originality, what's the newness, and what does it mean, and for whom does it mean? All of those things I think are really valuable. So I think one of the things that we're going to be sort of exploring today are the ways in which fashion and textiles as practices from makers, so we've got practitioner makers. Amy Winters is PhD, successful PhD finalist in soft robotics, in textile making with new discourses of smart materials, looking really at the interface between textiles and different kinds of technologies, different definitions of technologies, the way in which textiles practice can change the definition of technology itself, our understanding. And Victoria, who's going to be talking about how it is that fashion can challenge our very concept of a species. What is so special about being human, you know, and why is it that the human clothing does or does not have any greater value or significance than the appearance, the visual appearance and cultures of other species, especially microorganisms? So we're going to be exploring what it is about the practices of textile and fashion, taking in their broadest sense, how is it that those practices show us new ways of knowing and therefore new ways of thinking? What is it that's distinctive about what textile designers and fashion designers do that has not yet appeared on the sort of academic map of new methods of knowing, new forms of knowledge, new forms of collecting data about what constitutes new thresholds, new frontiers of knowing? And it's the kind of, it may sound like an exaggerated claim, it's the kind of claim that one is much more used to finding in things like medicine or the hard sciences or maths, or, you know, historians will say, oh, I found new data in this archive that has never been discovered before, or we found a manuscript of a little known Wagnerian opera that has now come to light in a carrier bag, and this is my new contribution to knowledge. It's much more traditional in other disciplines to find very specific definitions of newness, new knowledge. But in fashion and textiles, it's a much more complicated journey. Very often the kinds of knowledges that are being explored and found are tacit knowledge, they're silent knowledges, they're things that have traditionally passed as technical skills, that is, the knowledge and wisdom that belong to a group or a class that was not particularly revered or admired. They were thought of as the technicians that would help the master stylists or the master designers, and that their contribution would go either unacknowledged or with a minor acknowledgement for kind of assistive. But we're thinking of what it is that is creative, intrinsically creative and intrinsically innovative about the skills, the tacit knowledges of the makers in fashion and in textiles. And they're varied and they're hybrid. And I think what this afternoon, like the previous iterations of the Research Alive Symposium, it's taken place in New York, generously hosted by Carl Farmer, who hosted it at FIT in New York, and we'll be hearing more from him later today. It's taken place in London a couple of times, once in Battersea and once here. So this is its fourth iteration, and each time it's slightly different. Today we're looking at the concept of rites of passage. So it's a concept that was invented by anthropologist Arnold van Gennep. And Arnold van Gennep was, first of all, a textile maker and a textile historian. So his PhD was about textile traditions of Europe, and he was a particular historian of weaving. And it was as a weaver that he was very interested in the rituals that circulate around cloth and the meanings of cloth and the uses of cloth. And after his PhD dissertation on cloth and weaving, he turned his interest was really around folklore, that is, a sort of anthropology, but the anthropology of Europeans themselves, not the anthropology of, as it were, other cultures. It's about European cultures. And he turned his attention to the traditions and the rites that exist within European cultures. And he was the first to come up with this concept of rites of passage. That he said that there is within European cultures, in fact universally all cultures, there's a particular set of rituals that apply universally to all people that mark rites of transition, the moving from one status to another. So typically, the example he chose were rites of passage to do with a transition between childhood and adulthood, maturity, maturation, what we now think of biologically or culturally as sort of adolescence. But for Van Gennep, his idea was that this was a socially symbolic transition. It wasn't a biological maturation. There may be biology involved in it. It may be, in some senses, to do with an evolutionary development. But it was its social manifestation that he was very interested in. He was very interested in the way in which people ritually are removed symbolically from the status of childhood dependency, the closeness to the maternal, are removed into a relationship with a peer group cohort. So this is what he calls the liminal stage. There's the preliminary stage, which is the state of being a child. The liminal stage, which is being outside of society in a group of peers, and either geographically outside the village, in a hut outside the village, or out doing the wanderings across the desert if you're an Aboriginal, or going on a specific pilgrimage journey if you belong to another different culture. So every culture has its own way of marking this outsiderliness. And within Europe, that outsiderliness is very often marked through fashion rituals. It's to do with looking different, dressing differently, identifying primarily with peer groups, communicating primarily through things like the music and the appearance of peer groups, living within that space, that liminal space, for however long it is, and then re-entering, and the term that Van Gennep uses, the neophyte. The neophyte re-enters into culture, society, then in the form, after a series of ritual performances, if you like, they can sometimes involve painful experiences like being tattooed, or these experiences very often to do with symbolizing the severing of links, the severing of attachment, the severing of tenderness, that attachment of childhood which is about pleasure and about dependence and about being a seamless part of a group. So rituals of severing, of separation, of perhaps scarification, perhaps tattooing, or perhaps symbolically severing, just being so different that one is no longer part of one's origins. Then one re-enters, as it were, the social group as the neophyte, in whatever form that social group will allow the re-entry to take place. Now, the interesting thing about fashion is that it continues as a liminal space throughout one's life. And people can enter into the fashion liminal zone from the age of 3 or 4 if they want to be Madonna lookalikes, or if they want to, be Beyonce look. And then they can carry on living in the liminal zone until they're 100. The liminal zone is no longer a temporary stage that people inhabit only when they're 20. It is a culture. Fashion is a culture of liminality. So I think there are ways in which the idea of rites of passage has tremendous significance for fashion as a culture. However, we're looking at it today in many, many different ways. We're thinking about it as education. What kind of rite of passage is learning? And what does it mean? What kind of learning is research learning? What kind of rite of passage is it to stop being a graduate student and to start being a lone researcher? What kind of journey is that? What is the research journey? What's meant by that? And what are the rituals that take place? But primarily we're interested in what kind of new knowledge is generated by fashion and by textiles, and what can we learn through the dialogues, discussions. And it's Eve who's proposed this idea that one thing that's specific to the kinds of learning that happens in fashion textiles, practice-based research, is play. So Eve has pioneered, really, through a series of cross-RCA workshops and practices, different techniques of thinking of play and all the theories of play as a way in which new knowledge emerges that's different from studying in the library or the literature review or data collection through metrics of observation and questionnaire and so on. So what kind of process is play, and what kind of knowledge is play, and how does play as a process reach through to levels of experience and knowledge that are not captured in any other way, not manifested in any other way? So we're going to start the afternoon, the symposium, with a dialogue, a discussion between Eve and her colleague Tim Stevens, and Tim is doing a PhD at Sussex University, so he's a researcher himself, but also is a lecturer at UEL, at University of the Arts London, in learning skills, and particularly in learning around dyslexia and non-neurotypical forms of learning. And the non-neurotypical forms, I think, are actually key for understanding. We're not just talking about special needs. Let's be nice to special needs. You know, it's not about the exception that has to have legal representation for being non-typical. It's that there is within the neuro-non-typical mind the key to understanding something about the way in which creativity works. Yes, and that's not the same way as the way in which traditional syntactic learning works. We're not talking about additive knowledge, we're talking about lateral knowledges, synesthetic connections. Well, let's wait and see what it is that constitutes that difference between the neurotypical, the neuro-non-typical ways of learning. Eve and Tim, thank you so much. Thank you.